The task force, just for a little background, actually was created through Public Act 19-90. So it was in 2019 it was created. But during a July 2020 special session, the Connecticut General Assembly passed its only public act of that year because of COVID, 20-1, Public Act 20-1. And it was certainly in response to George Floyd, as was referenced in what we just watched today. And it included a lot of elements regarding police accountability, but it also added priorities for the task force to evaluate and then come back and recommend to the General Assembly. The final report is due towards the end of this year, and we will most likely be releasing it in January of 2022 in anticipation of the legislative session beginning in February of 2022. Now, in order to do the work, we've created subcommittees. There's public awareness, the improving police interactions with the disability community subcommittee, and the logistics subcommittee. And all of them are addressing the 12 charges that were given to the task force to take a look at and recommend back. The ones that we're going to be talking about today are directly in line with what was just discussed in the 60 Minutes video. And they are recommendations that come out of the first two subcommittees that they mentioned. And they reference police interactions with individuals who are mentally, intellectually, or physically disabled, and the merits and feasibilities of strategies that can be utilized by communities to increase recruitment, retention, and promotion of both minority and female police officers. Although through our work, we realize that the disabled community should be a part of that conversation as well in terms of diversity. So here we are tonight, the last of the three sessions that we've planned for December, although we do plan to continue the conversation into January. And we're going to present on these particular strategies, talk a little bit about the work, bring in task force members, and then again, hear from you. So right now I'd like to bring in Dr. Ann, and she's going to talk specifically about what the task force looked at and some of the areas in terms of diversity that we have, that members have actually recommended.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. Let me go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint for the presentation. Okay, great. Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be having this conversation and getting feedback from community members on these particular recommendations. But I just want to briefly cover sort of what is our reasoning and what we were thinking about when we came to these recommendations, and sort of the thought and rationale behind the 4 recommendations that I'm going to explain. One of the things that's really important to remember is that when we think about diversity, that there are various different types of diversity, right? And so the first one that I'm going to discuss is racial diversity. And this is really interesting in that more recently in the past couple of years, we've had some really prominent studies with rather large sample sizes, including one out of Chicago, that suggests some of the things that we had known through smaller studies that were a little less robust, including some findings, including Black and Hispanic officers use less force than white officers. And they also, Black and Hispanic officers make fewer stops and fewer arrests than white officers, right? And that this potentially can reflect sort of this greater reliance on community interaction and problem solving. And then the other component of understanding racial diversity among law enforcement personnel is also the idea of representative bureaucracy, right? And a lot of times when you talk to people who live in a very diverse community, they say, I'd rather, I feel more comfortable when I talk to an officer that may represent my background or might understand some of the cultural norms or may look like me, right? And so while there isn't a whole lot of empirical support for the idea of representative bureaucracy, we do know that that can be a really kind of important social component related to diversity. The next area is gender diversity, and this is really my area of research interest, studying women in policing. And so once again, we have, a variety of sort of mixed evidence in studies related to women in policing. However, there's a lot of support for some of these conclusions, including the fact that female officers use less force, right? They engage in less corruption, and they're less likely to coerce individuals, right, in their interactions. They receive fewer complaints and are less likely to engage in misconduct or corruption, right? And so nationally, we have about 12%, 12.5% of officers are female, and that's plateaued for about approximately 15 years. However, we do see larger departments tend to be have more female officers, right? Where smaller departments have less female officers. And so this sort of gives more evidence to the idea that perhaps diversifying among the lines of gender would be really important for law enforcement to consider and to be able to actually have that happen within their police department. I often then discuss the idea of the kind of together these benefits of gender diversity, racial diversity, right, and different backgrounds, right, equals this idea of ideological diversity, right? And that often when we think about these things, being able to frame problems, to understand problems, to think of new solutions, right, less likely to have groupthink if you are involved in an organization where people bring different ideas to the table. And so ideally, we really support this idea of diversity, because then police departments would be able to come up with solutions to their problems by having a diverse set of perspectives at the table internally before sort of pitching their solutions and plans out externally to community members. So this brings us to the 4 recommendations that we'd like to discuss tonight and sort of get feedback and understanding on. The first one really is stipulating diversification and community involvement goals within each agency in Connecticut's written directives, which are reviewed for accreditation by Commission of Accreditation on Law Enforcement Agencies for agencies or another accrediting body, right? So that instead of thinking about community involvement as something that agencies might do if they have an interest in, that this would be part of the accreditation kind of goals and requirements, right? Based on whether it's an added to CALEA or the other way in which we would accredit organizations within Connecticut, that there would have to be some component of community engagement, right? In the work that I'm doing currently in Austin, we have a curriculum committee where we have community members, academics, individuals at Austin Police Department engaging in discussions related to curriculum. So we're able to get that community engagement about what we're teaching, right, cadets and officers at sort of the ground level, so we can make changes and take community input, right? And so in this, agencies would then decide what type of community engagement would they be involved in, and making sure that's part of the plan, because it then feeds back into their accreditation. The next one is more, I'm just going to kind of briefly touch on, because there are many sort of promising practices related to recruiting, hiring, training, and promotion. The reason why I utilize the word promising practices instead of best practices, or some more kind of rigorous words related to something having an empirical basis, is that unfortunately there aren't a whole lot of studies that really support some of the ways that we might be doing recruiting, hiring, and training, right? And that's just due to the fact that within these kind of constraints of, whether you could do a randomized control trial for hiring on who gets hired or not based on certain criteria would be really difficult from a legal sense. So we're not entirely sure what works, right? That being said, there's a lot of research out there that supports some of the things that are sort of what we would say are promising practices. But I've often found that agencies are really unaware of even the promising practices, right? They traditionally go back to the things that they know through, someone else who previously did the job or what they heard, or maybe anecdotal evidence from sort of what they've seen while being there, right? And that one of the things that we really want through this recommendation is this state level dissemination of these promising practices to sort of make sure that agencies know how to do this work, right? They know how to think about equity issues related to promotion, and how can they actually have policies and practices that support diversification across the board here. And then the third recommendation is establishing a diversity and equity inclusion unit within post, right? So in the end, when we think about this, it's making sure that departments have a plan in place, right? Given all the promising practices that they have received, and do they actually have a plan to think about how to concretely, how to diversify their particular agency, right? And that within this would actually be sort of within the compliance unit at Post, saying now we're doing the data collection and we're looking at the numbers and we're seeing, the number of individuals that are up for promotion. Is there any sort of disparate impact? What are agencies struggling with, right? And then also assessing that against their particular plans. And so this is really sort of kind of the accountability process of these plans, but also in some ways, and I always kind of remind agencies when I work with them, it's being able to target what you might be weak in so that we can put time and resources towards those types of things. And so this is really the advantage of this particular recommendation. And then the last one is a fairly new concept in certain ways about civilian staff, right, within law enforcement agencies and their roles and responsibilities, and whether those can be expanded into things like social work. From watching the 60 Minutes presentation on Austin Police Department, right? Thinking about having social workers respond to mental health crises, right? As opposed to only officers, right? What's really, I think, interesting about this particular recommendation is as we started having these discussions, when I went to go find the statistics on diversity within civilian staff and law enforcement organizations, they don't actually collect it at the national level, right? So this would be a really great kind of first step for the state of Connecticut to say, hey, we now will know who our civilian personnel are, what are they doing, and what is the demographic makeup. And I think this is really an important opportunity to really know what are people doing within law enforcement organizations, what are their roles, what are their responsibilities, and then who are they, right? As they're working towards the same goals as within law enforcement. So in the end, and sorry, I looked at the chat because I always worry about missing a question, but I know we'll have question time in a little bit. I just want to sort of conclude the presentation by saying we would love to hear about other recommendations within this idea of thinking about diversifying within law enforcement. I think we've hit some sort of major themes with really solid recommendations about how to do it. But we really want to, consider other recommendations or feedback related to this. And so we're really happy to be here and to have this, this session. Thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate hearing the rest of the dialogue and discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Ann. And now we'll be going to Stan Simpson. Stan, as I'm sure many know, is a longtime journalist here in Connecticut. I shared the story last night of being a newspaper boy in the early 70s, delivering the Current with his column in it. Those cold December days, putting the Sunday paper together. Thanks, Dan.
And thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Andrew, for dating me. You were just a kid when I was writing columns. I don't believe it for a second.
But we've known him all throughout TIC 1080 on his own Fox 61 show, and we've had him moderate a number of our events for the IMRP. I know his passion lies in this area, and we're very happy to have him here again tonight. So Stan, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for having me. Folks, we're going to have a very engaging conversation. We want to get you involved, so I'll be monitoring the chat. We've got a very distinguished panel, a lot of really decorated people. So the rules of engagement are very simple. We're going to have a robust conversation. We want to get some thoughts and feedback from you, and then hopefully we can move the needle a bit on this whole issue of diversified police departments and how to deal with compassion, equity, and empathy with folks in the disability community. The guests, we have 4 guests today. This is our 3rd day in a row that we've been doing this. Some have been here all 3, but this is our last leg of our tour. So we're having some fun with this. We have Dr. Kringen, who you heard from already, gave a great presentation. Once a police officer in Virginia, which I think is always fascinating, going from a former police officer to someone who now is a national expert on diversity, policing, race, and gender. A great juxtaposition. Look forward to hearing more from her. We have Dr. Maggie Silver, Deputy Chief, UConn Police Department, oversees several of UConn's campuses, 25 years in law enforcement. And we talk about diversity and how do you recruit people. I want you to listen to this. Dr. Maggie's pathway to policing, very untraditional, came to America from Puerto Rico in 1986. Struggled with homelessness with a single mom and evolved into she was an officer at East Hartford and now the police executive and also has her PhD. So from homelessness to a PhD, what a remarkable story. So we always look forward to hearing about her journey, and it's always so authentic. We also have another chief, Jack Drumm, police chief of Madison, about 40 years in law enforcement, 25 years with the state police, a highly decorated officer. He's earned commendations for bravery, outstanding police work, and exceptional service. Thank you for your service, Chief. We have Jonathan Slifka, a champion in the diversity community for services and programs. He is the executive assistant to the Commissioner, Connecticut Department of Aging and Disability Services. He's the governor's liaison to the disability community, and his mission is to increase outreach, empathy, services, and programs for the people with disabilities. So we're very happy to have him and his perspective. Some interesting takeaways. You look at the 60 Minutes piece and Dr. Ann's presentation, and I'm gonna start with the 2 police chiefs. One takeaway, 80% of police calls, they say, are social service related, 80%. You know, the old adage is police officers say, hey, listen, I'm not a social worker, I'm here to be a cop, but the reality is 80% of their job is social work related. The second one is that cops of color and women are less likely to use force, according to the data. And then the third is that we had Maggie Peterson, who was a researcher here yesterday. She mentioned that 30% to 50% of folks who die due to police engagement have had some kind of disability. So all the data shows of all the folks who died through police engagements, up to 50% have had some kind of disability. That means visible or invisible, learning disability, autism, et cetera. Again, very profound. And then another point I thought was interesting, that the reality is law enforcement really can't prevent crime, right? All they do is respond to it. So the question is, how can we respond better with more empathy, more diversity, more equity? So let's start with Chief Maggie. Dr. Maggie, as I call her. Do most officers realize and chiefs realize do they realize that 80% of the calls are social service? Do they realize that cops of color and women are less likely to use force? Is that statistic or is that data known throughout departments?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, the more data that is out there, the more studies, it shows that, most of those calls, mental health calls that come to us. But what we have are governments that continue cutting resources And when they think about, well, who's going to do it? And they keep piling it onto the police. And they say, well, we'll train them on them. And they expect a police officer with 8 hours, or let's say even 16 hours, have the ability to do what a social worker that has gone to school and has done numerous hours of social work and hands-on training can do in a call. And often police officers are called when people are having the worst times of their lives, and we have to kind of get there and kind of find out what's going on, and that's very difficult. Uniforms are a trigger sometimes for people with mental illness, and they don't know. You can't see all disabilities, right? And they're trying to figure out the scene and what's going on. So I think we know the problem. The problem for us is, how do we fix it? We can't put officers through years of social work school. We don't have that kind of resources. But yet the community wants us, expect us to respond to those calls.
So Chief Drumm, is the fact that police officers are leaving in droves, they're resigning, retiring, some are saying, wow, this is really troubling. Can that be a good thing? Is there an opportunity for leaders now to say, listen, a lot of these folks are retiring. Some are saying, hey, the public no longer has respect for us. But is it the reality that they realize that 80% of the calls are social services related, and they maybe didn't get into the business to be a social worker, so they're leaving? Is that an opportunity for police chiefs?
One, I concur with Dr. Vargas has stated, Maggie. Listen, the majority of the calls for service, we get somebody who's involved in a psychotic episode, needs assistance. I would say maybe 10% require police presence. And also what we learned from our training is that a police officer arriving on the scene, the uniform, the weapon on his or her hip, sometimes inflames the situation. For us, we're trying to work our way to introducing an MSW into the response to how we respond to those calls. Another point that was made was that, listen, I'm going to show my age. In the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, we started decriminalizing, shutting down hospitals, particularly the area of mental health and other issues, and we're basically putting people on the street. So the police agencies in this country became the handy men and women of response to something. You know, most departments, I'm a smaller agency, so we'll have maybe 52 to 60 some odd thousand calls that will come in on a 911. Of those, probably 21,000 are actual police response calls for service. The majority should have gone to, in this state, 211 or the national response for people in crisis or people needing assistance in mental health. But the police became the agency to go to for people's issues. Even today, I mean, when people, post-COVID has been interesting. I truly believe that COVID has affected, you know, I know the viral effects of COVID, but for me, I always focus on psychological effects of COVID. And in my years, I've seen a tremendous change in the population and people. Taking this to police officers. I think if you look at the national discussion for the last, we'll say, 3 years pertaining to policing in this country. A lot of police officers that are very good. Listen, the majority of police officers in this country are very, very good, dedicated men, women, and others that work to do this task, dedicated to the position. Be sure as heck they didn't show up for the money. I think they felt demonized in some respects, demoralized in some respects. And listen, I don't know of any police officer that I work with, hopefully, that would ever condone the violence we see against individuals caused by at the hands of a police officer. We are very, you know, in Madison, we've been CALIA certified and advanced certified, dual accredited, starting this process in 2012. And as I spoke to the other night, you know, we took over an agency that was in crisis. We replaced the majority of the police agency. It was a changing of a culture. So I think that of a lot of opportunity is coming into policing. Listen, it's changing. And if I could understand this and work with it after so many years of policing, I think that most people should be able to, most people that are executives should also be able to work towards this common goal.
I do want to get Jonathan. I want to challenge the notion, Jonathan and Dr. Rand, that all the police are leaving because there's disdain from the public. I want to challenge that, because I think that what if someone said, listen, maybe they're leaving because they're really figuring out that it's not a good fit. If the social worker calls, I didn't really come to be a social worker. 80% of my job is social working. And so is the disdain from the public issue a red herring? It would seem that for a lot of officers, they're finding out that this may not be a good fit for me. 20 years into the force, I didn't really come in here to deal with social work. I wanted to be what I thought was a police officer and use my authority. Jonathan and Dr. Rand weigh in on that notion, if it's fair or not. Is that a fair notion?
Well, I think the hard part, Stan, is we just don't have the
Dr.
data.
Let me do one. I'm sorry. Let me start with Jonathan. I want to get him in because
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah.
I was going to let the good doctor go first, Stan.
Yeah,
but
she's a star. She's the star of our show, but I want to get you in as well. Too, so
I think Stan, I think you're on point. I think that you know, and I want to highlight, and hopefully I can highlight again later on down the road, a very critical point that Chief Drumm mentioned. The mental health, the beginnings of the mental health crisis in this country started in the 60s and the 70s, when we started to close down the institutions. Because when the federal government and the state governments began to close down institutions, they didn't put adequate money towards an alternative method of treatment for the people that were being sent back out into the public, right? Back into the streets, if you will. And now here we are with a shortage of social workers in this country, and an increased population that needs help. And it's growing exponentially, and we've seen it. And again, COVID, I think, has made it even larger. And as a result of that, and we've seen with the statistics, with the calls that the police get nowadays, the job of policing is different than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Chief Drumm knows this very well. Deputy Chief Silver knows this very well. It has changed tremendously. And so I think it's absolutely a reason that the police have begun to retire, because I think particularly even in the last couple of years with COVID, it's made it even worse. And it isn't what they went into the job for, and so they're leaving.
Dr. Ann, why can't we just deal with that candidly? I mean, to some degree, there is some public disdain, but your data is extremely compelling. It's a dated job description, and they're realizing it's not for me. And you've been a police officer, so you have an interesting perspective on that.
Sure. And so I'll sort of answer this question twofold, right? One is the challenge is I don't think we have data on exits to really understand the phenomenon, right? And so I have the same argument within PDs when we have the same discussion. And, you know, sometimes people will say, but I know that this one officer left our particular department because they don't feel supported by the public or whatnot. And they're now in a suburban department, right? And so they still love policing, but they just don't want to deal with maybe the public scrutiny, right? Yet we really don't capture, and this is, I think, the strength of the second recommendation related to promising practices and sort of retention and promotion, and then that data collection component is we don't know why officers leave, right? We sort of know on a one-on-one basis of why officers might be leaving, but we don't really know in an aggregate kind of trend basis what is really happening, right? Could it be that people are retiring because they've hit retirement age and, you know, the contract negotiation means that they lose something financially, so this was the right time? Or is it, you know, sort of the fact that this is a climate that they don't really want to work in anymore? And we don't really know. And I think there's probably truth to some of that, but in terms of what is the actual trend, I'm not entirely sure that we have really accurate data on that. So that's kind of my first data point, you know, argument that I usually think of when I think about especially these recommendations and the need to actually collect robust statewide data on law enforcement to really help to understand some of these phenomenons. And then I think my second answer to that is usually sort of the more personal, Stan, which is, you're absolutely right, is that sometimes people go into an organization or to a job and they say, this just isn't what I expected, right? And this isn't what I thought I would be doing. And now I'm, maybe needing to put someone in handcuffs, and that's not why I signed up. I signed up to serve or to be helpful. Or, these are more social work calls, and I don't know if I have the skills to be able to do so, right? And I think that's a training gap question, right? Which is like, and I know Post is doing a lot of work on their curriculum, and that they're, really thinking thoughtfully about these types of things. And I think if we can actually think about what are the training deficiencies when people come through, and then organizations or agencies can really think about what is the expectation gap between what the officers are getting, we might be able to retain these officers, for longer, given that.
So the other clear data is that cops of color and women are less likely to use force. Go back to my chiefs on this. Why is that, Dr. Maggie?
I think when we look at the data and we look at women and individuals of color, many of us come from certain backgrounds that really give us more empathy, the ability to de-escalate. Women tend to be more nurturing. That's, than men. That's just, it sounds like a stereotype, but it happens. And I don't want to downplay that there's many men, especially nowadays, there's men raising children as well. So they're becoming more nurturing. But also I think that because of our backgrounds, and for me, growing up in the inner city and having very adversary relationship with the police, and my 19-year-old self hating the police, it's about respect and dignity. And many of us that have that background, we understand that individuals that live in the inner city, in the poor neighborhoods, underrepresented individuals, are affected by socioeconomic situations, but they don't want to be defined by just because I live in the inner city, I'm selling drugs, or because I'm living in the inner city, I must be someone who's getting in trouble. And I think that for us, I know that as a police officer, I always remember, the homeless me, the person who was struggling, the person that was trying to do the right thing, often judged with the same stick than everybody else. And that's what I think allows us to probably just look at things and be more empathetic and possibly use less force.
Chief, I want to go to Chief Drumm, and folks, remind you, folks in the chat, if you have any questions, I see some here. I'm just paying attention now. So you have questions, put them in the chat. I will see them. If I don't see them, Andrew or Ken will nudge me along to see them. So put your questions, comments in there, and we will get to them once you be part of the conversation. Chief Drumm, that statistic, did it surprise you as a white police executive, decorated officer? Did it surprise you to hear statistics that say that cops of color and women are less likely to be engaged in force on the PD? That surprised you?
Actually does not.
Why not?
Well, I've gone through my years of policing, and when I had female women officers within the agency, they were always best at de-escalating before we knew what de-escalating was. They were best at CIT before we knew what crisis intervention training was. I remember the first time when I was here like a week, we had an issue that came up. It was related to homicide. And I pointed to the woman officer. I said, she had children? They go, yes, good. Have her come in. And I sent her out to the scene, and she stabilized it quickly. And the officers, the males, were standing out there like this, not really understanding how to do it. Those that had some advanced training, they did okay. But that's why I believe that. I just want to make one point to, if I may,
Sure.
to what Dr. Kringen stated, and also Dr. Silver. What I always fascinated me in law enforcement is we send police officers out all the time to deal with people at the best or at their worst, majority, or in crisis. And it's coming, we're working on it right now, but we never ever, particularly in the earlier days, I'll use that term, we never spend enough time on the decompression or the after action involving these police officers. You know, we're sending MSWs out, and we hire one. We have to have somebody so they could critique and critically be managed by somebody advanced. But we don't do that with cops, the police officers. You know, we do now. We're doing better. We have behavior associates. We hire different companies. We do peer-to-peer. But it just always amazed me that in all these years, they never ever. It's kind of like, oh, police officer, you'll be fine. You know, and I've had 2 people retire because of crisis.
I'm going to go to the question from the audience. And again, encourage all of you with questions to chime in. Make your questions tight for me if you can. I want to keep them tight and concise. We'll go from one from Janet Bauer, who asks, how much do police training courses really engage and deal with cultural engagement, getting officers, I won't say comfortable, but engaged in communities that may not look like them? Large degree, you have a lot of discomfort among officers, and we'll be very candid. White officers in urban areas or a Black officer in a suburban area, if they aren't used to the community, how do you get them comfortable? Because if they're not comfortable, there's going to be an automatic fear when there's time to engage in maybe a agitated situation. So to all you out there, what can we do about training? What specifically can you do to get empathetic training for folks who are from different cultures? We'll start with, since everyone's looking at me like who should go first, we'll go with Chief. We'll stay with you, Chief Drumm. We'll stay with you. What can we do about training? How can you revamp? Dr. Ram was involved in revamping training with Austin. How do you train officers to be more connected to their community?
Maggie, you're on. This is
for me, Chief. Yeah, Chief. Yeah, for you, Chief.
Okay.
What suggestions? What things can happen now? What's not happening now? What would you think should happen? You're in Madison, so maybe that's, I don't know, demographics out there, but how would you get a white officer in Hartford to feel more comfortable if he or she's assigned to the North End and really haven't dealt with anyone Black, Latino in their lifetime, but now they're assigned to North of Hartford, and there's those stereotypes, perceptions?
Well, I grew up in the Hill in New Haven as a kid, 1 of 6, and we were pretty poor. And our neighborhood was Black, white, other. It was United Nations, and that's how we grew up. And it was a great place to grow up. And you didn't see colors. You know, it was great. But for me, and by the way, I really didn't care for police when I was a kid. But
for a cop who's not like, who didn't have the same background, for that cop who grew up in a homogenous society and is now dropped into a community that is extremely diverse, and maybe because of the upbringing, they're uncomfortable. How do you change that discomfort? Can you?
Well, I think you can. I think that. I think that when you immerse yourself in an area, or most certainly immerse yourself within a community, get to know people, sit down. I talked the other day about having that cup of coffee, a lot of it, and meeting with leaders within the neighborhoods, meeting with leaders within the clergy, particularly in an urban environment. I think you get a better understanding. I could speak to, one of my assignments at the State Department, I was sent to the island of Jamaica and met some of the greatest people I ever met in my life. And, they accepted you when they asked you to come to church. And they, for me, I was a white individual within a community that was made up of all walks of life. But it took sitting down, understanding, listening, engaging, being open, and eventually you can get there. Now, there probably, and maybe exist, people that have no interest, that they probably should, and those folks probably should have no interest in policing. Because today you're going to meet people from all walks of life, all issues. And I think that you have to be open-minded. I think you have to be 360. I think, and I use this term a lot, you have to climb up into people's balconies and look down and see what it is they see and what their environment is for you to learn truly or make decisions, or particularly decisions that affect the outcome of something.
The idea was floated at one of our sessions of a community service for police, for young rookies coming in, right? You have community service for people who get arrested sometimes and maybe it's a minor infraction, and part of the penalty is community service, go out in the community, do some good work through the church or whatever, right? Is there a way with your training before an officer gets to carry a gun in a neighborhood that he or she's not familiar with, that they're mandated to get involved with a church organization, a sports league as a coach, help out of the soup kitchen, get to know some of the restaurant owners before they're actually issued a badge and a gun, and report back to the chief on who have you met, who have you talked to, what have you learned, so that they can break down whatever barriers may be there on that. Let's go to Jonathan on that one, and then you all can chime in after Jonathan. That issue of community service for the police officers, new ones.
I think the chief is absolutely right. I think, you know, you initially want to be seen, but I think the key to that would be to be seen in your civilian clothing. I think that's a key element to that. I think if a police officer is seen, you know, walking a beat but not walking a beat, to be recognized and learn the neighborhood, there's something about that that could be off-putting, if not triggering, particularly to members of the disability community. But if that same officer is willing to you know, go out for a cup of coffee on a day out, on a day off, or, you know, again, visit some restaurants, visit some you know, local hotspots in the neighborhood. And by the way, I would suggest hotspots for adults as well as kids, right? Because you want to develop that concept of community, trust, and safety. And I think if that officer were to do that, especially in the early days before they've established any sort of routine as an officer, it can go a long way to building that sense of trust and safety and community with that officer. And then that extends to the department in and of itself, right? Because that can affect the department's reputation.
Let's go to the chat room. Thank you, John. Dr. Maggie, I'm going to direct this one to you. It's from Valerie. Question about homelessness. Homelessness is out of control in many cities, she says, especially in cities on the West Coast. What is the solution to this public safety and mental health problem? Should there be any criminal penalty if homeless drug addicts refuse to go into treatment? And are we adding a public health problem? And as I stated in the intro, Dr. Maggie, you struggled a bit with homelessness before you became a police officer. So this is right up your alley. Your thoughts on that question?
I would say absolutely not. You know, that would contribute to more of the problem if you are criminalizing individuals for, you know, the cards they've been dealt in life. Many of homeless individuals are having traumas, whether it's, you know, child abuse, sexual assault abuse. They become already victims as homeless people. So the last thing we want is to just criminalize being homeless when we as a country are not addressing this issue and are not providing homeless individuals with resources. And it goes back to the resources. You know, throwing the book, arresting someone is not going to change the behavior. I mean, it's just going to create more issues. So what we need to look at is the homeless problem and see how we can provide resources, and whether that is allowed individuals with more housing, allowed individuals to get some kind of education. But arresting individuals because they're homeless just will add to the problems. That's not a solution.
Jonathan, thoughts?
So I want to go back very quickly to what you and I discussed last night, Stan. This is the sort of the trail of breadcrumbs conversation. So if you'll allow me a moment. What we heard in the presentation is that 80% of calls into 911 can arguably be handled by social workers. We also heard a statistic last night that 75% of the prison population is African American or Latino. What was not shared during the course of our presentation last night, but I believe Dr. Peterson did research on this, 50 to 60% of that prison population has some sort of disability. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a couple of things. One, I think that speaks to training of the police officers, as well as recognizing that there's an overextension of the police officers in terms of their duties and responsibilities. It also speaks to a shortage of social workers in the field. The supply is not meeting this overwhelming demand anymore. And this goes back to what we said earlier about, going back to the 60s and the deinstitutionalization and where that's left us now. It's left us with an expensive problem, and the longer it goes on, the more expensive it's going to get. So we need to figure out ways to solve that now. So when you're considering, I know we've heard the term of defunding the police. When you consider reallocating of funds, you need to ask a couple of questions. That prison population that's been diagnosed with a disability, when were they diagnosed? Were they diagnosed pre-incarceration or during their incarceration? Regardless of when they were diagnosed, are they of a population that cannot afford services? If they are, we are creating a vicious cycle, because what happens is they'll get treatment when they're in prison, they leave, the police continue to be trained the way that they have been trained, which is not to the level of, I don't want to say it's not adequate, but it's not to the level of being a social worker. And then those people go out and they commit another offense or create a crisis situation that brings the police back in, and those folks end up back in prison. Okay, so now let's talk about action steps. What can you do? The first is you need to provide ongoing and adequate disability training to the police, such that they can recognize triggers and behaviors of crisis. But don't force them to extend themselves into the position of social worker. So there's a gray area of, well, where does that training stop? And people in the social worker world can answer that far better than I could. The second thing we need to do is develop ways to infuse our system with more social workers. We have to, because it's the only way that we're going to tip the scales back in the other direction. And then the third thing is we need to do continuous research and studies into increasing the affordability of services to the disability community within the corrections, and then beyond, to develop and maintain a continuum, so that when those people get out of the prison system, they can continue to get the help that they deserve and that they need. Because at the end of the day, far too often, the people who need the most help, Stan, are the ones who can't afford it.
We're going to do, thank you, Jonathan. We're going to try this with our chat room. We're going to, for those of you who want to, again, join the conversation, we want to hear from you, and we're seeing your questions. A lot of questions are very long. We want to try to bring you onto the platform so we can hear you. So if you have some questions, put them in the chat room, make them concise, please. And when I see them, I'll call on you and we'll bring you up and you can speak directly with who you want to speak to. So we'll give that a try, but again, encourage you to keep your questions concise so we can keep things moving. Jonathan, you alluded to the stat, 75%. This was a few years back, and when I was a journalist, one thing that compelled me about this whole criminal justice system in Connecticut, and this was I forgot what time frame here, but there were 18,000 prisoners at the time in Connecticut. It's much different now, but 75% of the inmates were Black and Latino in a state where those two populations comprised 25 to 30%. 75% were inmates in prison. 75% came from the urban corridors, Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven, and 75% also shared one thing in common: they had not finished high school. So what I saw as a young journalist is that basically you had a lot of Black and brown kids who were functionally illiterate going from the schools to prison. Dr. Rand, talk about that. To what degree does that still exist, the school and prison pipeline? Have all you all chime in on this, and also our folks in the audience. The school and prison pipeline is real. The data shows that. In Connecticut, you were probably 4 times as likely to be arrested if you were someone of color than if you were not. Thoughts on all that? All you can chime in on this. Dr. Rand, the disparity, the racial disparity, the new Jim Crow.
Yeah, so I would say, one of the things that I think is really important in the work is being able to kind of think about these types of things, but also have officers understand how to utilize discretion, right? And so, I've worked with agencies where we've had community resource officers, or even, areas where the school system actually has its own police department. So they're able to be trained and to understand, how to think about treating juveniles sort of differently given where they are in their developmental state. But I really think in some ways I'm not entirely sure if I'm the best person. I tend to usually be very laser focused on what is my specific area. And so I think that it is something through more understanding about how officers can utilize discretion. When do they start to intervene, or how did they, what are the different ways that they can handle a situation that may not lead to that type of in the system approach. I think is really, really important, and one that I think that there's an ongoing discussion still on the discussion related to homelessness, right? And the idea of, well, is it criminalization? Interestingly enough, Austin is probably one of the cities that where we did not have a camping ban and then did, right? And that was voted in last year because of the fear related to, watching cities like Portland or San Francisco, and that the police department in the city really had to have a very kind of long-term strategic plan so that it wasn't, hey, on this date, now every single person's getting a citation or going to jail. What are the ways in which, we can think about letting people know where housing is? Can they be bused? Can we think about these types of things? And so I think a lot of the, thinking about what the potential consequence or outcome, criminalization or going into the system, I think if you have the time and the resources and can step back and really acknowledge that you have the time and the resources, you can think of other ways to handle problems that maybe don't deal with going to the system. And I think schools are probably very similar in that situation.
All right, we're going to bring in Irv, and I'm going to bring back Valerie, who wanted to clarify her question, but I wanted to make sure that Dr. Maggie could weigh in. As a Latina and a police executive, when you hear those statistics, 75% Black and Latino, 75% from the urban corridors, 75% with no GED. As someone who's a Latina with a PhD, what do those stats tell you?
I think that we need a lot more education. And I want to say that as a state, as a country, we need to think about over-criminalization as well as the structural racism that exists. And do we have enough opportunities to get people, officers, the resources? I mean, officers arrest someone and bring them into the system, but they're not the ones putting them in jail. Officers, if they're going to make another decision, if the law is there and they're there to enforce the law, they're doing their job. And if we're not giving them other resources to move those individuals to, they have no other option but to make the arrest sometimes. There are specific things that they have no other option to do that, especially if, they might use, like Ann said, discretion. But if that call is coming in 3 or 4 times, discretion only goes so long, and then they have to act. So we need to think beyond the officers just making the arrest, but we have a criminal justice system that is structurally is racist, that is not measuring everyone with this, correctly, and is putting a lot more underrepresented individuals in jail, and that there is not enough education. For me, I was fortunate that my father, although all he had was a 3rd grade education, he instilled in me that the way to move forward was to educate myself. And it was like a daily basis. He was a very kind of peculiar man, because he wasn't the greatest husband. He abused my mother and he abused me physically, but he also believed that, he used to say, don't marry a lawyer, be a lawyer. So it was kind of a weird message. He empowered me at the same time. But a lot of individuals don't understand that. They don't understand the opportunities. A lot of inner city people don't understand that even if they went to jail and made a mistake, there's still a chance for them to go to school. And they don't see themselves. They don't see people that look like them being police officers. I get still a lot of people who are like, oh, wow, you're a police officer? Right. And you're a deputy chief? And how did you get there? And it's, to them, it's like, wow, someone that sounds like me, looks like me is there. How is that possible?
Yeah,
And I think like that.
we got to get a book deal and some kind of movie rights for your life story. I want to be the agent who can get you the book deal, the Netflix movie, HBO. We're gonna go to the chat room. Irv, we're gonna bring you online on the Zoom. You have a question? Ask you to keep it concise, and then we'll go to Valerie. So Irv, if we can bring Irv up, he has a question for the panel. Irv, how are you? Is Irv there?
Did you mean Bernie?
Oh, I'm seeing.
I think Liv.
Liv, I'm sorry.
You took your glasses off, Stan.
I took my glasses off. You're right. It's Liv. Everyone, it's not Irv.
I got it. Hang on one second.
You're on. And then Valerie, and then we have two more coming in. So you guys will join the conversation. Ask your own questions. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, so we're promoting them, and if folks just accept that, then they'll be brought up. And
so yeah, we can go ahead and preload Liv and preload Valerie, and we have two more coming in. I'm going to keep this running, and then Ken, we have John, or yeah, who else did John? No, that's John. Another question. Let me know, Ken, when you have questions coming in and you're ready to bring them up. I'll keep the conversation going. When you're ready to bring up Liv and the rest of the folks, just give me a thumbs up, and we'll go to those folks live. Fair enough?
Yep.
Okay, so Chief Drumm, what has worked in your vast experience and looking at other departments, looking at your department? You had to come in and do a turnaround in Madison. You had all kind of challenges there. We talked in the earlier session. One thing that does work, you got to kind of change people around. As far as changing culture, you got to sometimes get rid of people. You can't always change people, but you can get rid of them. Can you talk about that?
If you're going to grow, any agency is going to grow, and you're going to have to change that culture. That's pretty well known. It takes a lot of courage to do that. You know, they talk about leaders. So, well, that person's a leader. Leader is actually behavior. Leadership is behavior. And as I spoke to the other day, it's not practiced by many. They're afraid to. It's a scary place to go. But that's what you have to do. If you're going to change the culture, particularly of a police agency, and depending how embedded it is and rooted troubles are, it's going to take a lot of courage on that individual to jump in and affect change. I talked about some of my experiences with that. You know, I removed, and we're a smaller agency, I removed essentially half the agency, actually a little bit more. A lot of the officers that I brought in came from cities. For a smaller agency, we're pretty diverse. I think that I had one, you know, and then they talked about this in Camden, is that it's not just the police executive that dives in to change this culture. You need the cooperation and partnerships in order to make the change. That includes the resources to do it. A lot of people will bring in an executive in policing to say, fix our problem, but don't increase the budget. You can't do that. You're going to have to bring in extraordinary training that costs money. You're going to have to bring in additional resources to help you get that department, whether it be certification on a state level or on a national level, such as CALIA. That costs money. There are programs available now for departments to make application for grants, but you have to have the partnership. In the case of what I did was, I took the external factors that affected policing. I went out into the street and I talked to, you know, many people. I talked to people that hated the police in the town. I talked to people that had lawsuits going with the town, that were aggrieved by their interaction with the agencies. And eventually they got the understanding as what we're trying to do, and they watched us as we evolved and came out of our dark days. It took partnerships with boards of finance, selectmen, the police commission, all working together to make this work. They had your back, so to speak. So it's easy to say, we'll bring in a new chief. And I've seen a lot of chiefs come and go in some of these major cities in a short period of time. I think they figured they're going to walk in and wave the wand, it's going to change. No, they come in, you have to make them a partner immediately, and they have to work within all the agencies that support police and everything within government in that town to move that forward, or it won't happen.
If you want to bring in Bernie Michel to the conversation, you see him on your
Yeah.
Zoom platform.
I'd like
Bernie.
to introduce Bernie if I
Okay.
could, Stan, because
Sure,
Bernie's
sure.
an old friend of mine and a
Sure.
neighborhood pal from Asylum Hill.
Sure.
But he's also had a long established relationship with Neighborhood Revitalization Zone, which is a really important organization, specifically within Connecticut's big cities set up by state statute. And Asylum Hill has had its own neighborhood revitalization zone for quite some time. And Bernie served as the chair of that, the board, but now I believe, well, has served as the executive director as well, I think the first one, but full well knows the relationships between neighborhoods in Hartford and what it takes in terms of engaging police and the various aspects that Chief Drumm was just talking about. So he mentioned CSOs, the community service officers, so I'll let him talk about his perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. That's a warm welcome. Yeah, I have found over the years, and we have the Asylum Hill Neighborhood Association has been the NRZ for about 22 years now in Asylum Hill. And we've been fortunate to have some really excellent CSOs to work in the neighborhood, but they're essentially only one man covering, 1 square mile, and they can't work 24 hours a day or anything like that. But I think that training that they get, that ability to know the people, to work with them, to really help, to be there to enforce the laws, but also to let people know that their cooperation is really important. I actually had the opportunity recently to have lunch with the current class of cadets and talk to them. And I think that was something that they just set up. And it was really great because it was an opportunity for the cadets to all sit with and meet with some of the CSOs, especially some of the, I think, more active ones in Hartford, and talk to them. And then also I was there just as, a member of the community. So I really believe that that's an important part of this, is just figuring out that the people you're serving are really human and getting to know them even as possible on a one-to-one basis, the quirks and the issues and things like that people have.
Bernie, well said. Thank you for your
Thank
time
you.
on that. Now, John Lucas, I'm reading through the chat. I don't know if John wanted to be on, but John was saying, as far as the prisoner pipeline situation, the pipeline is real. And part of the problem as he sees it is that history is still not being taught accurately. So he calls it white male history, and that when you are dealing with urban kids and they don't see any relevance in their life and what's being taught, it creates an attitude where they'll do things that will lead them to the criminal system. So he's kind of echoing the importance of education, and more importantly, teaching equity in history and inclusion and diversity, so kids see themselves and see their role and see their value. They don't know who Paul Robeson, he mentions, they don't know who Paul Robeson is, and we don't teach about historic Black Latina figures and women, and that becomes part of the problem. So I don't know if anyone wants to chime in on that we talk a lot about police and community. What about the educators, and what degree are we letting them off the hook for dropping the ball on what they're teaching children? Anyone who wants to weigh in can weigh in. Maybe Dr. Ann, with all your research, has anything come across your research radar that educators and what the kids are learning in school contributes to the disdain for police, disdain for themselves, and being more more vulnerable for bad behavior?
I think that's hard because there's so many things that happen during that school time period that to really parse out that particular variable, right? And that, quite frankly, we haven't been teaching, kind of critical theory in school long enough to really know, what is the difference, right? However, I do think to this point, and I put in the chat the post curriculum has recently been changed to include history of policing and civil rights, right? And that like part of the thing, and in Austin, we also have a history of race and policing in Austin for our course. And part of those things are having those discussions of saying, you can't understand, you know, how we got here in policing without actually understanding the entire history related to this. And then I think the only other thing that I would say that I've seen anecdotally is that when it comes to things like theory, that a lot of times, especially police officers or even individuals within the criminal justice system who often see themselves as people who kind of move things forward, right? Like they need to know what to do about it. That when I've seen them be trained on kind of critical theory, the question is, I may believe this is true, but what do I do about it? Right? If I'm the officer doing the arrest, or what are those types of things? And so sometimes really giving examples of saying, but you're in charge of policy, right? Or you can look at the hiring processes for police departments, or you can look at sort of, you know, what are certain areas, and giving them sort of an idea as to what you would maybe do, or how you work with the city on making changes, right, is really kind of a good start to producing change. Because I think, especially as a researcher, we can theory to people to death, right? But if they don't really know what to do with this new education, it can be really problematic, or maybe not problematic, but it sometimes won't lead to the outcomes that we hope, right? So giving those initial tools, I think, is helpful.
What about, you know, about alignment? You're a researcher, I'm a, you know, communicator. So when I hear critical race theory and defund the police, you know, it just sort of, you know, I shiver when I knew right away when the term defund the police came out, it was going to be very problematic for well-intended people. And I think critical race theory, everything gets politicized to what that means, and therefore never moves forward. You see it being politicized now as something that is not what it's intended to be, as opposed to just saying American history in its inclusivity. My belief is that critical race theory has become this buzzword politically that just brings it a whole different path. The same as defund the police, that just the language itself is so undermining to the well intentions of the cause. Thoughts on that? That was my political opinion. That's my opinion. So I'll leave it at that. That's just my opinion. We'll let it drop. We'll see to go into the chat room, see what else is happening. Again, folks, feel free to come in. Yes, Val is still working on Val, and John, we're waiting for you to, someone's gonna give me a heads up as far as what's next. So right now I wanna go back to Jonathan, the disability community. There have been a lot of proposals on how do you having better engagement, more constructive engagement between police and folks who have visible disabilities and invisible disabilities. You talked about the importance of officers being able to distinguish a visible disability from an invisible one, because a lot of tragic situations happen because a person had an invisible disability, which the officer took as aberrant, even offensive or threatening behavior, and there are problems. So let's talk about that. Invisible and invisible.
So Stan, what's the specific question?
So the question is, give us some clarity on why it's important for an officer or a public official to know, to discern when there's an invisible disability, and how that can, if they don't see that invisible disability, how it can lead to a lot bigger problems.
Sure. Well, I think it leads to, I think this goes back to training. I think this goes back to constant engagement with the disability community so that they can help you understand. Because as we've talked about before, many disabilities can present acutely or extremely, or they can present in mild, mild actions or mild behaviors. And it's important for the police to understand, particularly if they're in situations where they're by themselves, what they need to be looking for in certain situations. And that's not always going to be their first instinct when they show up to a situation. We heard yesterday from a gentleman who mentioned that he was watching YouTube videos of traffic stops that had gone wrong. There's certain disabilities where let's say you have a mental, intellectual, or developmental disability. You're driving. You're not in crisis at that moment. Everything is fine for you. You're obeying the speed limit. You get pulled over. The reason you're getting pulled over is a broken taillight, but you're not aware of it. So the cop comes to the policeman comes to your window. They ask to see your license and registration, and immediately that triggers you into crisis. The sirens and the flashing lights may have done that before the cop even comes to your window. So your reaction is to question the police. Police are trained that they give orders, people are supposed to follow them. And when they don't, that person is not in compliance. And then what happens from there, right? And so they would view that person asking a question as being not in compliance, and will address that accordingly. But that could come from a behavior, a triggered behavior, because that person now goes into crisis. And they got in their car not knowing that they had a broken taillight. And so in that situation, it may be a legit question. It's certainly a legit behavior, but without proper training, the police might not respond to that properly or correctly, and it could lead to a bad result. And we've read far too many stories where something like that happened.
I want to go back to the recruiting. The issue was diversity and also dealing with equity and empathy with folks who are with disabilities. Dr. Maggie, we wring our hands a lot about how can we recruit folks of color into the force? What do we have to do? Can we do it? You're a person bilingual, right? You were dealt with homelessness. You were a single mom. You mentioned you came from an abusive background. What made policing intriguing to you? What was the pitch? What made that to be an intriguing profession for you? And you even mentioned that you hated cops, I think, at some point early in your life.
So what made the policing intriguing to me was absolutely nothing. If you would have told 19-year-old me that today I'd be here as a police officer, as a deputy chief, that I would have a better understanding of both sides, and I would have just slammed my door. I'm like, no, I don't like police. My interactions with police when I was in the inner city, especially when I was homeless, were extremely negative. I really hated police officers, and but I knew I wanted more out of life. So I was able, with the help of a wonderful social worker when I was in welfare, to help me get into school, help me get into college and start my education, with the goal in mind that I was going to become a attorney who was going to prosecute those cops that were harassing me and so many of people in my neighborhood. But education is a wonderful thing. And if you're open to learning, if you're open to learning about others, then you get two sides of a picture. And that's what happened to me. I was looking into policing, and I knew that a lot of good people were getting in there with the right mindset, but that we needed change. And that instead of just pointing the finger, that it was important. So I joined the police 25 years ago because I wanted to make a change. And that's what I have focused most of my career in working with people, working with officers. And when we talk about recruitment, it's difficult. It's difficult to bring minorities into a police department. I very often, I'll go to the chief of police meetings, and I might be the one female of maybe 2 or 3 females in that room. And I might, and probably, I will tell you, I was in a meeting the other day, and I was the only female and the only Hispanic female at that. So it could be, you're surrounded by men. I was blessed with a temper and a high, strong will, so I can carry my own. But it's not easy to go into a place where you're a minority and you're really in your face. And when you go into recruitment, selling that can be very difficult. So when we recruit, I think that it's important for the police departments, and we talked about how do we get police officers into neighborhoods to understand neighborhoods better? And someone mentioned community, doing community service. And I agree 100%. But I also would like to say that when we start recruitment, we start looking, when the person applies, have you already done? That should be a preferred qualification. We should all look at those applications and say, is this person already? They all tell you in a board everything you want to hear. And the first thing they tell you is, I'm here to serve and protect. I want to serve my community. Well, did you wake up this morning and decided to serve your community? Or what have you done at this point to serve your community? Are you out there in a soup kitchen? Or are you out there helping in DCF? Or what are you volunteering in already? Let's make that an important point of coming into the force, that you already are showing us that you want to help the community, that you're not there just to slam handcuffs and not ask any questions. So, and that would also help us get individuals of color into recruitment into the police department ranks.
Interesting. I want to go back to the chat room because Valerie wanted to clarify her earlier question. She says, I wasn't advocating criminalizing homelessness. That wasn't her point. Her thing was, how do you create incentives for people to get into programs if they refuse to do so, if they have a drug issues or mental illness issues and there are programs there and they're offered and they refuse? Her question is, what can we do to get people who are having these challenges? What incentives are there to make sure they get the help they need rather than just besides offering it to them? Dr. Maggie, you want to stay with that? That's up your alley, sounds like.
Sure. Okay. So I think the first thing is that we need to have better resources as a community. Often individuals who use drugs or something, they're self-medicating, they're suffering mental illness. I have a family member who struggles with schizophrenia, and for many, many years, he self-medicated himself and he went in jail. With that thought, we need to think about the resources and how are we helping it. And there are individuals who might refuse that help because they don't understand how to get that help. As a community, we just need to do better, and not just dispatch a police officer. My fear with saying that police officers are going to go and we're going to criminalize someone who refuses to get help is that then again, we're creating situations where we can escalate and result in force. Because individuals may not understand why as the officer just doesn't leave me alone. So as a community, we need to reach out to our healthcare to do more research and find out how as a community, what other countries are doing. There's many countries that are addressing these issues that we are struggling with. So maybe get it out of our own way and start looking at what else we can do to address this that does not result in dispatching a police officer.
Great, thank you. I want to go back to Liv or Irv, as I called her earlier. Liv had a question. I'm going to just condense it. Trust, the issue of trust and transparency in police investigations and accountability. I think the point is, if police departments are more transparent with their investigations, with accountability, with the chits forward they may, if the citizens see that the police are willing to be transparent in whatever happens, then that builds trust. When you're able to correct your own, call out your own, penalize your own, that builds community trust rather than when they perceive that you're hiding something. Chief Drumm, how do you take that one? Trust and transparency in investigations and folks feeling that police are not being a little disingenuous when it comes time to investigating their own situation.
You have to have the ability to self-police. You have to have the ability to use the word transparency, integrity, congruency. I'm going to reach it to a relatively short period the last couple of years. When an issue comes up, you have to address it quickly. Issue comes up, you have to be very transparent with it. And if I may, just to recant a short event that occurred within my own town. At an office, I had somebody call in a car that was weaving on the road. and the officer caught up with the person that was on the cell phone. He pulled the car over, and the person behind the car appeared to maybe intoxicated to him. So the officer with a military background, he's entered the car from the passenger side, and he's, as John pointed out, he's used to giving commands. So this this individual was slow to respond. He assumes that he is intoxicated and impaired. The gentleman is not understanding him. It's not a language barrier. He's just having a hard time responding to him. So the officer's getting frustrated, ends up pulling this individual out across the seats. He now puts him on the ground, handcuffs him, and he's continuing with this. Now, eventually we send a supervisor sent up there. This happened on a weekend day, it was a Sunday. Supervisor is a new sergeant. He arrives at it and he's watching as this officer is just picking up and dropping this person on the ground while he's handcuffed, trying to get him to cooperate with him. And the guy's trying to explain to him that he hasn't been drinking, he's so sober, and he wants to know why the officer's being so rough with him. This led to the officer leaning down and putting a chokehold on the individual. This is on a video. The sergeant with the 3 stripes is watching this. What I know now is that that sergeant was basically in horror, didn't know what to do. How did this end up? Well, that individual that got pulled over, he was arrested. I was brought to my attention the following evening. It was brought to my attention before I did the camera reviews, which we do regularly for Q&A. The officer, the sergeant was involved, reached out to me to tell me that he had an issue and explained it to me. He immediately started an inquiry. We pulled the video, we see the video, it's clear as day. The officers immediately put out, well, we investigate this. There's a conversation immediately with state's attorney where I released the video immediately to them. I also asked to reach out to the victim. What I know now that I didn't know then, but it came out in the investigation, here's an individual who had a bad accident, suffered traumatic brain injury. He wasn't on drugs, he wasn't drinking, he had a disability. Not to extend this conversation any further.
I want to kind of get to the chat sheet. So just, was the officer punished?
The officer was removed from duty. The sergeant was demoted and suspended. The individual met with me and his lawyer allowed him to do that with the insurance carrier for the town to make him whole. The video was discussed and they decided not to prosecute on the police side, but the officer was decertified.
Gotcha.
We did that within 90 days. I hope people understand there are leaders in this business. We will self-police. We will be transparent.
Thank you for sharing that story. Andrew, you have Will from ACLU. He wants to talk about defunding the police. You want to bring him up?
You wanted to respond to your thing there.
Oh,
and also I did want to mention that Bernie, Michael put back in the chat after Deputy Chief Maggie responded about the community service provision, that he thought that was a good measure for incoming officers. So yeah, I mean, it's an important thing. And I saw Janet's comments as well about what's going to come next, and we can finish off with that after the conversation.
And I want to go to Chief Drumm. That was a great example you gave, because the officer was punished, decertified. And again, as a media person, I don't know what you guys did from a PR standpoint. The next step would have been to make sure that the community know and your rank and file knew this guy was a bad actor and you got rid of him. And I think that's when it really helps. If he was decertified and got rid of it and no one knew about it, then that didn't help you all. When you do that, you got to then come public and tell everyone, hey, this is what happened to our guy. That's what I think the last question was talking about. Be very transparent. We punish our own. We don't tolerate this. And that's how the trust is built. So I just wanted to give kudos to what you gave, but give context to what the gentleman was saying. That kind of transparency, I think, is what he was talking about. So I don't want you to comment. I just want to tell you kudos, and I hope you guys went public with that and let the community know we got rid of him. So let's kind of close things up here. I think the
Well,
question.
this is, we were gonna give Will a chance if.
Oh, Will is back. I
he's-
think, okay. I
He's
think
here if
Will,
he wants to turn
okay,
on the
Will is
screen and
here.
ask the question.
Okay, I thought
Yeah.
Will was gone. Will, welcome.
Good evening. You know, this is probably the first time I've been in a recent public forum regarding police accountability, police community policing, and to be honest, at sometimes I don't know what the direction of this panel is either going for. But what I do know is that community policing has never worked. This is not a new concept. It's been revitalized over and over and over again. It's great to have these conversations, but at the end of the day, the reality here, and I can't speak for California or the rest of them, but here in Connecticut, we have a very dire situation where we have seen police budgets increase by 3-4 million here in Hartford. Our police department has received 10 new drones in a city that 10 years ago, people would have been all over the place yelling and screaming about why are there drones in a city spying on us. Our questions about these drones have gone unanswered. Our community leaders, as far as our mayor and our legislators, they don't provide any answers. What I have seen is police budgets have been increased, but I've also seen more and more police committing more crimes that are being exposed. And those crimes that are being exposed are also leading to previous crimes that were covered up and the community did not know about, including DUIs that hurt people. They were still able to keep their jobs. Domestic violence that was covered up and they still not only just kept their jobs, but a lot of them got raises. We talk about diversifying the police force. That does sound good, maybe overall statistically wise, but the reality here is that we still have parents here who watch their loved ones get shot and killed by Black and brown police officers. Recently, we watched Anthony Vega Cruz stopped over by a Black police officer who then lied to the media. And that didn't come out until over a year later. By that time, it was already done with, and he was able to resign with a $100,000 care package, as we call it. We also have, tonight we did a vigil for unfortunately the death of Shamar Ogman, who last year was shot and killed by a Latina, Ashley Martinez, on the HPD force. The community has not heard a single response back of the outcome of that. Shamar Ogman left behind a 2-year-old daughter. The mother the daughter will never get to see her father again. Why? Because instead of HPD responding to the community's efforts on trying to get a mental health program established for calls, they decided to go armed and force and chase him down. Shamar Ogman, we don't know whether he had a real gun or not. That's irrelevant. The point that it's irrelevant is the fact that he was never threatening anybody. He was never walking in the middle of the street. He was behind his own apartment. That's another big issue too, is that we have police departments that they use the fact of fear of somebody might have a gun in a car, while also not respecting the fact that the right to bear arms in Connecticut is legit. So how is it some communities are afforded the right to be able to have the right to bear arms, while other ones are automatically, well, he might have a gun in the back, so we're just going to shoot into the car. So I love the concept of, talking about the community policing, but honestly, I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm old enough to have, I've been through the whole mass incarceration phase. Okay, I've done well over a decade in prison. I've been homeless before it. I've been homeless because of it. I came out a couple of years ago. I had all charges dropped for a false charge. I spent $5,000 of my bond money, lost going back to school, became homeless, was never able to recuperate anything that I had lost because under Connecticut law, there is no compensation once you hand your money to the bondsman. I was told in open court that the cops had no probable cause to arrest me. Take the GPS bracelet, you're free to go. This is the reality here because that same day, I watched 3 other people in that same courthouse walk away. When we want to talk about moving forward, it's great to talk about the future. It's great to talk about what we want, how we're going to solve these issues. But the reality is, we have not seen any police departments step up, come up and say, we want our police departments defunded. We want to give the community these resources. No, we've seen the exact opposite. I had discussion, we want to talk about COVID. COVID is a huge issue in Hartford, yet here I am trying to tell HPD to please put their masks on when they're going to Family Dollar, while all of us have to wait outside while they arrest somebody and they're not wearing masks. Now, as an ACLU Smart Justice leader, we personally have to deal with COVID deaths in prisons because not only police refuse to put their masks on, come to find out, most of them don't, there's no mandate for vaccinations either. So how is it that are we going to reimagine the police department when we're still talking about the same concepts that bring about mass incarceration? How we don't like to talk about the dozen or so murders here in Connecticut within the last couple of years? How are we not talking about the uptick in police that are getting charged with new crimes left and right? And their histories are being exposed where they're doing the same crimes that they're arresting people for, but because their charges get dropped. Why are we not addressing the hypocrisy in that? Because I can tell you that there are people that are doing time for the same thing these cops have gotten away with. We have a police chief, Doty, who was caught doing a DUI on the public highway, got to keep his job, yet is single-handedly handing out surveillance equipment to go after people doing the same thing. The concept of a policing, no human is perfect. That's why community policing will not work. We need better resources we need better resources that we have asked for and we do not get. Not a single thing done that has been done in Hartford that has been addressed with the community needs.
So Will, I think you're making the point that you believe it's still a very corrosive system. I want to thank you for your comment. It's still very corrosive. From Will's point of view, nothing has changed. And you're making the point that, hey, Black Latino officers can be just as abusive, which kind of brings us back to a question earlier we had. With this rampant increase in police officers who are retiring, some are seeing as, gee, woe is me, this is a bad thing. Is this in fact a good thing, a chance to really reimagine police departments across the country, bring in officers who are more inclined to service the community and not abuse the community? Chief Maggie, Will, I'm gonna have you hang on for, we'll hang for 1 second. Let the Chief, Dr. Maggie, answer this, if you don't mind.
I think, we don't, as Dr. Ann said, we don't really know what the individuals are leaving. We don't know if it's because they're feeling, if officers are feeling that are not supported. We have heard that. We know, and I know Chief Drumm can back this up, that, there used to be a time that we would have open a police search and we had thousands of applicants. Now we're lucky if we see a couple of hundred applicants. So we're definitely seeing people not coming into the field and people leaving the field. So the reasons why we would have to do a lot of soul searching and stuff, but I think that they're leaving, the fact they're leaving, yeah, there is opportunity to reimagine the police and see what we're gonna do and what changes and we can do. Um, I myself am a child of community policing. Just like the community doesn't want to be stereotyped, officers don't want to be stereotyped. They are, of course, every profession has bad apples and good apples, right? I do know that the good apples outweigh the bad apples, and that's what we need to do is to make sure that we're cultivating that good culture. Chief Drumm is an example of a department that had a lot of issues, and he cleaned up the house. And there's a lot of us that do that. I can't speak to what goes on Hartford, but I can tell you that many leaders are looking to profoundly as to what our practices are, how we can improve, and how we can take these officers who are leaving and we can reimagine what will work for us.
I'll have Dr. Ann go with that same thing. Your studies show a lot of things here. We've seen the rash of officers leaving. You're a former police officer. Let's talk again about opportunity. That may not be as detrimental as folks think. Could be a chance to really do something very dynamic. Quick thoughts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I just really wanted to thank Will for his comments, because I think in the end, this is, and I have this discussion in Austin as well, is that there is a move towards abolition policing, and that there's an important voice to sort of understanding why that is, right? And that if you don't hear it, and I think we haven't had this perspective actually being as, in the three panels that we've had thus far. I think it's an important point and perspective to be bringing to the table. But on that point, I think there's kind of two challenges, and because I think you're right, is that there's an area of opportunity. One being the research about, can we actually do this? There's some evidence. Cynthia Lum wrote a paper more recently looking at calls for service in the top 6, or maybe not top 6, but in 6 major metros over a period of time, and determined she's not entirely sure that all of these calls can be diverted to other types of services other than policing, right? And so there's a question about, can those calls for service actually be diverted, right? And that we need more substantial sort of understanding of the challenges, and then what are the services, so that we're not leaving people in the lurch waiting for these services that we're not actually providing them, right? And then I think on the kind of second folds for that is having a society that understands the complexities of these problems and that actually can agree to a certain degree on things like funding, right? And so you probably saw in the 60 Minutes episode in Austin, they made the decision to cut policing budget, to which then state legislator passed something that didn't allow the city manager to do it again, right? And so, so the budget for APD went back to normal for this particular budget cycle. And so it's really also making sure that we can do things that are sustainable. And so one way that I think this kind of panel has really thought about these recommendations is, if we are continuing in this model, right, what can we do to improve it? What is sustainable? How do we hold police departments accountable? How do we collect the data to actually do some of these studies? But I think always bringing in this critical perspective is really important. So I thank you.
Dr. Ann, I want to go to Janet real quick. She asked, what is next for the work of this task force? And we have about 3 minutes left, so bring in Andrew Clark, Executive Director, IMRP. What's next? We've been 3 days on tour here and got some good feedback, and lay it out. What happens next?
Sure. Well, first, I want to thank all the panelists who participated. They're members of the task force and also the researchers that supported us. But, John Slifka, Chief Drumm, Maggie Silver, Daryl McGraw, who I know, Will, if you had posed that question with Daryl here, he'd certainly have something to say about it too. All giving up their time to be here because they care. They care about the issues that you raised, that everybody raised today, and want to make things better. So they've been a part of a process now that was created by the legislature. The legislature ended the work of the task force by the end of this year. Although I think all of us have felt like, well, we have these recommendations, we don't want them just to go into the wind. And so that's why we're going out to the public. We want to let them know what we've been doing. We've been doing that all along. And we want to partner. We want to partner with other folks in the community that want to bring specifics to their particular town. Like if it's Hartford, if it's, West Hartford or Farmington, like we had the conversations, if it's other parts of the state. So we will issue a final report, and that will be come January. There may be some talk about continuing the work of the task force, in which case, it takes a while to unpack all of these things and to come out with, how exactly do you make that work in 96 municipal police departments? What about civilian review boards, which we really didn't even get to as much as we could have. And so I think we'd all like to continue that. And I think there is forward momentum, but it will require an urging from others outside of this body to be able to do that. So we do plan on having further conversations into January. We are in the process of planning them. As you can see, we went in person, which I think everybody agreed was a great opportunity to really get a sense of each other and everybody in the room. But with everything going on, virtual seems to be like it's what's going to be happening through the winter. So it'll be most likely there. We'll give updates to everybody who attended these, and as well as the general public. So you'll hear more from us. But as always, I do want to mention there is a survey that will be emailed out to all of the attendees. Please respond to those if you can. We had them in a QR code when folks were in person, but that's one of the glitches that we had. So we will send those out to folks. We want to hear from you. What are the things that we can do better, ways that we can improve? So thank you so much. Ken, I saw your screen's on. Did you want to say something too? Okay.
No, just tell folks to watch out. Probably mid-January, the final task force report will be released to the legislature. The hope is that the legislature, where appropriate, will act and raise a bill and make changes to laws where we've recommended. Many of our recommendations don't require legal changes or changes to the law. They instead require police departments, local communities to act, the Police Officer Standards and Training Council to make further reforms, and hopefully a thoughtful group like this task force will remain meeting and focused to help the state measure the reforms as they're being implemented.
All right. Well, thank you all. And thank you, Stan, as well, for being able to adapt to the virtual world here really quickly. So thanks, everybody. Have a good night and a happy holidays. And hopefully we'll see you all soon.
Thank you very much. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Bye, everyone.